All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Angie Dodson. I am the not-so-new director here at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts. And before I utter another peep, I'm going to ask that everybody grab your noise-making device and flip it to silent. Because of the weather and because of the traffic, I think we're going to have folks joining us as we go. So be a good neighbor to them and give them a nudge when they come in and say, turn it off. All right, this evening we gather as museum members to celebrate a beautifully diverse set of exhibitions opening at the museum this week. And we also gather as symposium participants here to see those exhibitions, yes, absolutely, but also to begin a 3-day exploration of Alabama's art and history. I'm going to start by just going through a little bit about those 4 exhibitions. The first is Power, Beauty, and Wisdom, Women in African Art from the Meta Collection. This is in our kind of largest, tallest galleries. This is from a collection from Dilip and Marty Mehta over in Atlanta. They are great collectors, great friends to the museum. This is the second time we've had an exhibition of their work here. And because this one allows us to explore kind of down the lane of women in power, I am especially pleased to have it in the museum. The 3 remaining exhibitions on view here at the museum these days are all related to Alabama and therefore to the celebration of our bicentennial. Charles Shannon is sponsored by Max Wealth Management. It is in the Wilson Orientation Gallery, sort of out toward the sculpture garden or the doors to the sculpture garden. This is a delicious little intimate exhibition. It is the result of a long-tended relationship between Margaret Lynn and the family, Margaret Lynn Osfeld, chief curator here at the museum, and the family of Charles Shannon. So you're going to be able to see some works by this Alabamian, by this Montgomeryan that rarely see the light of day. So this is a really special opportunity to be with his work and to be with his story. In the Wheel Atrium Gallery, just before you get back to Louder, if you want to wander back that way, you will see glass work by Cal Breed, who comes from northeastern Alabama, just outside of Fort Payne. This body of work are meditations on light and air. The exhibition is called Signs of Lift. So a beautifully meditative collection of glass works, extraordinarily beautiful at night. So we all should make sure that we have time to go see them this evening as they're lit for the nighttime hours. This exhibition has been made possible with the support of the James Wilson Jr. and Winona Wilson Family Foundation, Laura and Barry Harmon, and Dawn and Adam Schloss. The third exhibition takes us back to the galleries that radiate just off of the rotunda. That exhibition is called From Southern Shores to Northern Vales, Alabama Landscapes 1819 to 1969. This exhibition enjoys the generous support of the Alabama Bicentennial Commission, the Alabama State Council on the Arts, and Riverbank and Trust. It was curated by Michael Panhorst, who was one of the participants in this program. So I think we'll have an opportunity to hear from him here, and if memory serves, we'll also be able to spend some time in the galleries where he can talk directly about the exhibition. And now, to lead us into this evening's talk, just a few words about the symposium. This is a program that has been in the works longer than I have been director of this museum. To be specific, I think things really got cooking in the spring of 2018. It all stems from the vision of Ed Bridges, who led the State Archives for a very long time and led the museum for the year leading up to my arrival on the scene. He conducted that work with extraordinary passion and commitment. And he brought that passion and commitment to the formation of this program. The ever-wise Ed quickly invited the State Arts Council's Al Head to the table to talk about possibilities, and then I think Michael Panhorst was the third to join into the band of schemers and connivers. Shortly thereafter, Elliot Knight, I think, joined the conversation, as did Joey Brackner and Margaret Lynn Osfeld and Alice Novak, soon offered their voices to the conversation. So, other voices have been seen and voices heard and faces seen during the planning of this program. And they include colleagues from the Birmingham Museum of Art, Montgomery's Expose Art, the Jewel Collins Smith Museum of Fine Art at Auburn University, the Mobile Museum of Art, Birmingham Space 111, and the Wiregrass Museum of Art down in Dothan. We thank all of them, all of you, for your contributions along the way and for your presence over the next few days. None of this would have been at all possible without the financial support of the Alabama State Council on the Arts and the Alabama Humanities Foundation. Our intention for this symposium was and is to create a space where art, history, and other experts from universities, museums, and organizations across the state and nation join with fellow professionals and others interested in the state's cultural history for 3 days of lectures, gallery talks, panel discussions, book signings, and other opportunities for fellowship and exchange. We come together in community to both reflect on the canon of Alabama art and to continue to shape the state's cultural history that is still to come. Now, to set us on the course toward that, this 3-day program is this evening's speaker, Dr. William Eiland, who is the director of the Georgia Museum of Art. An Alabamian by birth, Bill received his bachelor's from Birmingham Southern College before heading way up to the University of Virginia, where he earned his master's and doctorate degrees. In my 30 years of work in museums, Bill's probably been on the program of about every professional gathering I have ever attended. And I have learned that he also has served on the board or as an advisor to those many organizations that sponsored all of those gatherings. Just to name a few, the American Alliance of Museums, the Southeastern Museums Conference, the Association of Art Museum Directors, and its Southeastern little sister, SEAMD, the National Endowment for the Arts, the International Council on Museums. When not serving the field, Bill has managed to write some 60 publications. Is that true? Is that so? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Curate exhibitions, all while leading the direction and daily doings of a museum, which I now know to be no small undertaking. Here to share with us Alabama Mother Mine, resident of the Kingdom of Cotton, is Bill Eiland.
Y'all, I've waited 32 years to say this. I've been at the University of Georgia for 32 years, and so I've waited 32 years, and if I can't say it now, then I can't say it. War Eagle. A good friend of mine went to the University of Alabama, and she pledged Tri-Delt. At the Christmas break, she went home to see her mother, who lived on a plantation in South Alabama. She told her mother that her pledge sisters in Tuscaloosa said that she didn't need to bring her own china, her own crystal, her own china or crystal or silver to Tuscaloosa, that it was all right to use paper plates and plastic cutlery. Her mother, eyebrows highly arched, responded, "Your sorority sisters must be from North Alabama." I'm warning you with that little tale that I will be primarily talking of Alabama south of Birmingham, the place where I have roamed for much of my life. Tonight, I'm going to ignore not only Dorothy Parker's quip that brevity is the soul of lingerie, as well as our own Tallulah Bankhead's asseveration that only good girls keep diaries. Bad girls don't have time. To wit, on October the 19th, I found myself on the campus of Birmingham Southern College, nostalgic, melancholy, and slightly depressed by the passage of time, as I longed for those halcyon days, those years of undergraduate fellowship to come again. I beg your indulgence as I tell you what I wrote that very day as preface to my talk this evening. How strange for me to be at the library, the same one I frequented much too rarely some 50 years ago, when I dutifully performed the research and wrote the papers that got me through undergraduate school. I am back here on this campus to prepare a series of events, at least for a committee meeting to prepare, and I find myself, just as when I was an 18-year-old, daydreaming of what was and what is to come. I hardly know what I am doing, since the young man behind the circulation desk at the library does not know how to help me find physical books. He suggests over and over and over again that I just make a PDF and send it to myself. I shiver with loathing at the idea and turn again to people-gazing. I watched the students of 2019 closely and found them content unto themselves. Indeed, they come and go, at least in the library, with some even speaking of Michelangelo. They are beautiful beings, all of them, though some may be lumpy and acne-ridden, bedraggled and self-conscious. Alas, they are young. But I'm not here to speak or to write of them. Rather, I am seeking information on their ancestors, on those mostly Southerners who lived some 200 years ago when Alabama joined the Union. Not my first foray into Southern post-colonial history, but this time I'm looking for portraits of indigenous peoples, of enslaved peoples, of the women behind those elaborate dresses and severe hairstyles. In that era, I will not find them, hard as I look, except for the lithographs from Thomas McKinney and James Hall's History of the Indian Tribes of North America, first published in 1837, and which contained biographical profiles of Indian leaders. What I do find are the usual suspects from the literature of Alabama's social, economic, political, and cultural history, those affluent or better-to-do residents of Alabama's post-frontier society of lawyers, doctors, and educators, but most of all, planters. I will have to wait until years later if I am to find the overlooked, the marginalized, the neglected. I have to anticipate the advent of photography when the general population has or can find the money to afford an image, even a self-portrait. Through the advent of the camera, they become visible as folk, as entitled as the well-to-do, to the portrait of a loved one, to the photograph as aide-memoire, as ingress to a personal history. What I do find in the history of Alabama, as it changed status from territory to state in a relatively short period of time, were the different expectations of planter and yeoman, of North and South Alabamian, of settler and politician, of rural and urban populations. What I also find that those theorists who argue that portraiture is not necessarily truth would find the image of early Alabamians pertinent to their arguments. Otherwise, her head would be on her body. I do thank you for inviting me back to Montgomery for this occasion. Nothing makes me prouder than to return to a state too often calumniated, the object of profound obloquy, perhaps deserved, but for all that, my home. A place where people speak my language, share my diphthongs, eschew my R's. If I may paraphrase one of Catherine Wyndham's loveliest stories, it is where we can go home again, in spite of our shortcomings. In her case, it was the ignominy of failing French at Huntington College after using her parents' hard-earned money during the Great Depression to go off to school. Her freshman year at quarter break, she fretted and worried over going home, knowing that that first ever F in her life was like a scarlet letter to be branded on her forehead forever. And worst of all, F is the first letter in French and in Français. On Christmas Eve at breakfast, she saw the dreaded grade report on the mantel of their house in Thomasville and groaned all day long over confronting her father at dinner and explaining how she had failed to honor both her parents' sacrifice and, well, French. That evening, after they all held hands for the blessing at supper, her father pronounced, "Today I had to go to Pine Hill to the bank, and then I had to rush down to Grove Hill for some other business. And then, to make matters worse, I had to go over to a meeting over in Camden. And you know what? Wasn't nobody speaking French." Some of us here may speak French, but our lingua franca, if you will, pardon the double entendre, is English, Southern English to be precise, with its gamut of Alabama dialects and accents. I am from Perry County, almost the center of the Black Belt, a place, that place, if you will, featured in James Agee's and Walker Evans' Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, a region of Alabama still home to or visited by writers and artists, certainly future architects at Auburn's Rural Studio, such thinkers as the late William Christenberry and Mary Ward Brown, both, like others, like me, intent on finding their roots or discovering the mysteries of what is too often seen as a benighted land. It was not always that way, even though its history of slavery and discrimination and violence, in short, what was to come, were already suggested there as elements in its colonial beginnings. My requested subject today is portraiture of Federal era or antebellum Alabama, but I have taken that assignment as a provocation to make of my talk a portrait, not of its peoples, but of the very state itself. What it was to become, the seeds of its successes and failures, at its sown at its very birth, and no place more emblematic than my home in the heart of the Black Belt, where portraiture was particularly esteemed as a mark of distinction. As such, we must briefly look at the history we share with Europeans in particular, but through other continents' stories as well. Images in dye and paint and stone of individuals both revered and despised, captured on the walls of the pyramids of Egypt, in the portrait busts of Rome, and in the post-Alexandrian Gundarian faces of sometimes mustachioed Asians. Succinctly, as an unidentified writer of wall text for a collection of old master paintings in El Paso, Texas, explains, quote, "Renaissance Italy witnessed a remarkable awakening, the rediscovery of classical writings, philosophies, and art that emphasized the value of the individual. Along with this awareness came the reintroduction of the portrait. Not since classical antiquity had the independent likenesses of men and women been popular, but during the 15th century, an unprecedented number of portraits were commissioned alongside sacred subjects. Over the next 250 years, the representation of the individual underwent an extraordinary transformation. Initially commissioned by the elite as social documents and symbols of wealth, portraits appeared on canvas, medals, busts, and tombs. The earliest examples are small in size and stress the accomplishments of men and the virtues of women. By the mid-16th century, artists began to depict individuals from varied social classes on an increasingly grand scale. 17th century Baroque artists painted dramatic scenes, as in the Caravaggio, while those of the 18th century Rococo favored elegance and grace. Throughout, the expression of identity was paramount. Attributes as symbols document wealth, honor, intellect, and sometimes pride. Certainly the portraits coincident with Alabama's statehood record the sitter's wealth and pride. Sometimes his or her intellect, almost always social status and honor, especially those commissioned of jurists and government officials. We must remember that central and northern Alabama, prior to statehood, did not share the same benefits as Mobile and the coastal areas where French and Spanish influences can be seen, particularly in official and domestic architecture. As the WPA-era writers of Alabama, A Guide to the South, Arts and Crafts, remark, quote, "The struggle for existence was too engrossing to permit any flowering of formal art. Likewise, the pioneers who settled in northern and central Alabama in the early 19th century were too occupied with gun and ox to devote time to chisel and brush." During this period, wealthy planners in particular sought out such artists as the Peel family of painters or Thomas Sully to immortalize themselves. Though hardly known as a portraitist of human beings, even John James Audubon visited Mobile and is said to have found there the model of his painting of the hummingbird that appeared in Birds of America. But primarily artists themselves came south in search of patrons and commissions. Such men as William Frye, Edward Troy, Joseph Thortz Moore from here in Montgomery, and Nicola Marshall are among the better known of the artists who actually settled in Huntsville, the Black Belt, Montgomery, even Tuscaloosa, Mobile, at least for part of their careers. Other artists, such as George Cook, were peripatetic and are known to have traveled to Greensboro, to Demopolis, to Florence, and to Selma, for example, and to have enjoyed the hospitality of patrons as they journeyed to find commissions. Edward Troy came to Mobile from Philadelphia in 1849, a little late for the period under discussion, but important to note because of his tenure as a professor at Spring Hill College for some 6 years. There in his studio on Bienville Square, he specialized in portraits and landscapes. But upon discovering the racehorses of Kentucky, he became known as the Landseer of America for the mastery of his equine portraits. In short, for his increasing negligence of the humans for the animals. Born in North Yarmouth, Maine, Joseph Thortz Moore moved from Ohio, where he was an itinerant artist, to Montgomery, circa 1830, with his wife and 3 children. There, he opened a studio here, where he taught painting and drawing. He was primarily a portraitist, but also advertised himself as a sign and ornamental painter. It is said that he painted more than 400 portraits before his death from yellow fever in 1854. His daughter, Harriet Newell Moore Hosea, became a miniaturist. Moore, Joseph Thortz Moore, is buried here in Montgomery in Oakwood Cemetery. Another teacher, this time at Marion's Female Seminary, Nicola Marshall, came to Alabama from Prussia, owner around 1849. After landing in Mobile, where he stayed for some 3 years, he headed north to Marion, where he taught art, French, and violin. His was a successful tenure in Alabama, with his portraits widely sought by those who could afford them. Early works by Marshall, before he returned to Europe in 1857 for further training, reflect a certain naivete, a clumsiness of execution, as in this portrait of baby Caroline Carlyle and her mother. The artist even served in the Confederate Army and designed its uniform, and some stalwart members of the UDC in Alabama insist to this day that he also designed the Confederate flag, the stars and bars. I hate to be partisan, especially in this case, but I think the jury is no longer out, and that the latter achievement actually belongs to an artist in North Carolina. At any rate, Marshall's paintings of the well-to-do of Alabama and Kentucky after his return from Europe and after the war became much more accomplished technically. Next slide, you'll note his signature. Somehow, however, these portraits lose their charm in a more formulaic and stiff presentation. One of Marshall's earliest works in Alabama also illustrates another dichotomy, this time the graceful figure of a little girl in The Hail Child, a painting found in a barn in Marengo County. But this is no ordinary portrait. Rather, it is a post-mortem image, specifically a mourning painting, or perhaps better stated, in this case, a commemorative painting of a dead child. Rather than a painting of a cadaver, a practice particularly of newborn babies, but even with adults, this portrait is of a child standing as if waiting to play, while an angel pauses to encircle the child and carry her off to heaven. You will note here the symbols of the child's status, living on the canvas with her coral necklace and music box, apparently a favorite of her toys, yet dead, in fact, in her black shoes and hand extended toward the roses in a funerary urn. Around and above her, that willowy angel points heavenward. The subject of post-mortem paintings of either sort is an entirely different and worthy study for another time. But we shall note here that these portraits of dead children and adults were not uncommon throughout the United States, especially frequent between the years 1830 and 1860, when advertisements appeared regularly from portraitists stating their skill in painting from cadavers and later from daguerreotypes. Any of these works may have used established symbols, such as we have seen a coral necklace and faded roses, to alert the viewer that these were commemorative or mourning pictures, meant to function, as the art historian Phoebe Lloyd tells us, as a means of communion between the living and the dead, or as an icon for the bereaved. Contemplating it was part of the mourning itself, the mourning ritual. Because the artist represented the deceased as alive, as in this portrait by George Cook of Fairfax, Lapsley, which is on the walls of your museum, a delicate balance had to be maintained between life and death. It was achieved in two ways. On the one hand, the figure of the deceased, generally life-sized, was placed in his former habitual environment. On the other hand, a death symbol, sometimes disguised, sometimes easily identifiable, was normally included. This portrait, commissioned from Cook by the child's father, is of Joseph Fairfax Lapsley. Those of you from Selma know that name well, who died in 1847 at age 2. Cook completed this portrait in 1848. The horse is said to have belonged to the child himself. And Lapsley père apparently asked Cook to include the confluence of the Cahaba and Alabama rivers south of the Lapsley family home in Selma. His clothing, the horse, and the still life all suggest the affluence into which the child was to be reared. The tree stump in the middle, dead and disfigured on the very banks of the rivers, symbolizes his untimely demise. Some of the symbols readily recognizable as clues to the death of the subject were weeping willows, drooping broken roses that may be dropping their petals, or the morning glory, a symbol of the new life that to this generation, to that generation, was death itself. Such symbology, especially the rose, appeared often on tomb sculpture as well, especially in the Northeast. Other symbols are less easy to distinguish, but may include attributes that the family would associate with the deceased, toys, books, even clothing. Shepherd Alonzo Mount, the brother of William Sidney Mount, wrote of the portrait of his dead niece, Camille, that, quote, she is seen moving up on a light cloud, close quote. A leitmotif we see again and again in antebellum posthumous painting. Another frequent symbol for little girls was, as we have seen, a coral necklace. More general discussions of early Alabama material culture are beyond the scope of this paper. Since we have so few portraits by women, by the way, one, a student of Nicola Marshall's, Mary Eugenia Jones, and almost no portraits of the enslaved and indigenous prior to 1819. We note, along with the author of A Guide to the South, while the affluent toyed with painting and filled the role of patrons of art, slaves and members of the small farmer families developed rare skill with miter box, hand saw, hammer, and needle. Many of the finely carved cabinets and mantels that graced plantation homes were made by skilled slaves who were also adept in ornamental ironwork, tinsmithing, and shaping utensils of varied design from pewter. At the same time, women of the farmer household were necessarily adept with their fingers, working with straw, pine needles, and pine cones. They made baskets and ornaments to brighten their drab cabins. Every woman perforce learned the art of quilting, and many of their intricately beautiful designs may be found in Alabama houses today. Their accomplishments in the history of Alabama's material culture are just beginning to be acknowledged, particularly in museum exhibitions and in this very symposium we inaugurate tonight. Certainly, during the years before and after becoming a state, Alabama was a frontier society, one in which, as Henry W. Hilliard described it, the essential demand of society was to see every man manly and every woman womanly. Having more males than females, girls often married young, as early as 13 to 14 years old. And it is not surprising to know that, quote, divorce was rare and required the approval of the state legislature, close quote. In this planter society, men expected women, in the words of the historian Lee Rawls Atkins, to be, quote, pious, modest, compassionate, quiet, and dainty, by nature self-denying and soft-spoken, a paragon of virtue, close quotes. And so they were depicted in the era's portraiture. Moreover, once married, husbands expected their wives to be obedient to them as heads of household, to be submissive, quote, whose only reason for being was to amuse and serve her husband, bear his children, and train them in the ways they should go, close quote. In short, the Southern lady was to be genteel, and by that was meant she was to handle all social obligations of the household, such as receiving callers, entertaining, and playing the varied roles of gracious hostesses. She was to be chaste and pure, hiding any suggestions of pregnancy in public while enduring the pain of childbirth with silence, close quote. Women's diaries and letters of the period reflected their dissatisfaction with social constraints and restraints, and in one notable example, Octavia Walton Levert noted that to be fettered and bound, yet seeming to be free, was worse than slavery, close quote. She wrote further angrily, talk about bondage and slavery. This is real bondage. Thus were women presented in portraiture of the period, even in Thomas Sully's painting of Madame Levert herself. She smiles somewhat coyly from a contrapposto pose at the viewer as she sits in an interior darkened enough such that her beauty and the formality of her dress shine forth. She was called the belle of the nation for her beauty, her sophistication, and her intelligence. A proto-feminist, she was a polyglot who traveled to Europe and occasionally wrote of her peregrinations in French and in English, as well as in Italian. As the daughter of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, George Walton from Augusta, Georgia, she had considerable social capital and spent such cachet reigning over Mobile's capital, social capital, antebellum world of ball and reception, of at-homes and carriage rides. She held a salon à la Française on Mondays, when not in Saratoga Springs, in Europe or elsewhere. Beginning at 11 a.m. through the evening, she received writers, artists, teachers, politicians, foreign visitors, actors, and celebrities of all sorts, Yankees even, gathered to discuss literature, the fine arts, politics, history, and philosophy. Why am I spending so much time on this extraordinary woman? It would not be unrealistic to see Octavia Levert, in fact, as both torn by conflicting loyalties and symbolic of the mythologizing of Southern gentility, grand hostess, and at the same time a spokesperson for women of all classes. Her husband was a prominent physician and thus had the wherewithal, considerable income to spend on her. When the Marquis Lafayette visited Mobile in 1825, she conversed with him in French. From 1853 to 1855, she traveled in Europe, where her reputation preceded her, thus assuring her immediate acceptance into the upper ranks of British, French, and Italian society. Upon her return, she detailed her experiences in Souvenirs of Travel, a book of much interest to cultured Alabamians. She had 5 children over 10 years, while bemoaning loudly the status and perception of women under which she chafed bitterly. In her own words, "Why should I strive in the paths of learning? Who will ever appreciate it? Who will ever praise it?" Indeed, the reality of most women, the wives of yeomen, of the freed and enslaved African Americans, of the indigenous Creeks and Choctaws, and even for the bourgeois mistresses of the planters themselves, was quite another story. Education for the wealthier women were in female seminaries, for the middle class and so-called Blackberry academies, for the others barely or rarely attempted, or even for the African American, the enslaved, illegal in most cases. Such attitudes persisted well into the 20th century, when, for example, the artist Lamar Dodd remarked of his youth in western Georgia and his first job in 5 Points, Alabama. He said, quote, "In the South at that time, women painted china and men painted houses." As we have seen already, we do, however, know the identities, if not specific works, of many of the male artists of post-frontier Alabama. In fact, according to a typescript manuscript in the state archives entitled "Artists Who Painted in Alabama Before 1860," almost certainly a list created from a thorough review of newspapers of the period, it is notable that almost all of the men listed were classified as portraitists of one kind or another. In fact, 43 are so identified, 8 as miniaturists and thus also portraitists, 10 as daguerreotypists, and 5 as ambrotypists. The latter 2 designations probably portraitists as well through photographic processes. An ambrotype is a photograph made by placing glass negatives against dark backgrounds. Interestingly, the coining of the word itself originates from the Greek word ambrotos, for immortal, and thus even more fitting for the families and individuals seeking images as lasting memories. The ambrotype is the direct ancestor of the better-known tintype. Given the time constraints and the burden I'm placing on your patience, I will not include here a discussion of the life and work of Philip Rumer, who also came to the United States. And Philip Rumer, who also came to the United States. I think it's forward one. Here it is. Who also came to the United States from Europe. We know that he was born in 1820, that he lived and worked in Mobile, that he served in the Confederate forces, but we have not yet confirmed his death date. We do know that he painted this arresting and piercing portrait of a Choctaw woman in 1850, a painting that indicates his European training, but with a New World subject. One artist, native-born in Huntsville, was William Carroll Saunders, who reversed the pattern we have seen of Europeans coming to America. He spent several years in Italy studying art. Saunders seems to have spent considerable time in Mobile, where he maintained a studio in the 1840s and where he took commissions for portraits and history paintings. And I show you some details. Particularly important is Blackwoods magazine there. Among those early painters, in addition to Marshall, Moore, and Troy, is an artist named Cook, with dates indicated in 1822. The earliest in these lists, and possibly a reference to George Cook, C-O-O-K-E, if the same Cook, C-O-O-K, who took out an ad in the Montgomery Daily Mail on April 12, 1860, then it cannot be George Cook, who died in 1849. But we do know, in fact, that George Cook, with an E, was in Richmond, Washington, D.C., and Montgomery in the years 1821-23. And you know the reason why. A native of Maryland, George Cook traveled the South after having studied in Europe, where he copied the old masters. It is erroneously noted or stated that this painting by Cook in the chapel at the University of Georgia is the largest in the South. It is certainly the most ambitious for its time and for the fineness of its execution. The businessman and early industrialist Daniel Pratt provided Cook a studio and gallery in New Orleans, and even had the artist buried in the Pratt family cemetery in Prattville. The artist William Frye came to the United States in the early 1840s from Europe. Born in Breslau in 1822, George Wilhelm Frye, later anglicized to F-R-Y-E, spent his formative years in Vienna and received instruction in Prague and Heidelberg. Peter Baldaya, in the recent publication commemorating this bicentennial, Alabama Creates, notes that in Germany, Frye was likely influenced by the high-keyed coloration and intense realism of the Biedermeier school of painting. While still a student, Frye became fascinated with James Fenimore Cooper's historical romances of frontier and Indian life, and was compelled to travel to America to experience the young country firsthand. Frye first opened a studio in Louisville, Kentucky, and a couple of years later, on or around 1858, a second one in Huntsville, Alabama. According to an article of 1868 describing his sojourn in Greensboro to paint portraits, Frye lived in Huntsville for some 20 years. In North Alabama, he is known for his portraits, but also his landscapes, and none more relevant to our dual purpose tonight than this image of the Alabama River of 1850, which is in the Selma Public Library usually, but tonight it's here at the Montgomery Museum of Art. Frye returns from his travels throughout Alabama and reopens a studio in 1858, when we learn from an advertisement in the Southern Advocate that Mr. William Frye has returned to Huntsville and can be found at his old room and is ready to serve his friends and the public. An earlier notice of March 5th, 1847, indicated that the location of his studio at the time was, happily for him, the Bell Tavern, a felicitous location where portraits will be taken, quote, true to life, close quote. Frye became known throughout the South, so much so that he was commissioned for $3,000 through a nationwide competition to paint the portrait of Henry Clay for the state of Kentucky in 1865. By the way, Henry Clay was a good friend of Madame Levert's, a work that had the full approval of the state's governor. As Baldaya tells us, the end of Frye's life was marked by failing health after 1870, when he suffered several strokes and was committed to the Alabama Hospital for the Insane in Tuscaloosa, where he died at age 49 in 1872. Apparently, near the end of his life, he painted this oval portrait of a bearded African-American man with glue bucket and brush, posed next to a page from the Louisville Commercial. This photo is from Case Antiques' sale of January 27, 2018, lot 108, buyer unknown. The oval painting, portrait, or genre sold for $15,000. Painted portraits in Alabama prior to the 1840s may not give us the whole truth or context in which they were created, but they do give us a record of formal dress and fashion, of conventions of representation, and even to a degree, cultural context. And I want to show you an interesting painting that is in the archives here in Montgomery. Next slide, please, in which this portrait, if you'll notice, she's wearing a cameo, and the cameo on her arm, on her wrist, it is that chain there, the gold chain, connects the cameo of a Roman figure on her breast, along with the gardenia, to her arm, on which is the bracelet that accompanies the cameo. I've tried to include here such emblems along with the portraits. Of particular interest, I think, is the convention of a flower, a rose or a carnation, even a camellia, at the décolletage of a lady's dress, again suggesting purity and piety. The scholars Dale Couch and Martha Severance both suggested to me that this motif is one introduced in Charleston, then spread westward by Jeremiah Theus in the 18th century. The popularity of daguerreotypes, or ambrotypes, as media for portraits was immediate after the introduction of photography in Alabama by 1839. A daguerreotype is a photograph taken by an early photographic process employing an iodine-sensitized silvered plate and mercury vapor. By 1846, Huntsville's Southern Advocate remarks, quote, "The wonderful accuracy of portraits taken by this new process makes them truly valuable," close quote. It is not until later in the century that we have the first photograph of an unidentified black man taken and developed by a black photographer. According to Francis Robb's Shot in Alabama in 1839, after Samuel F.B. Morse, himself a portraitist, met Louis J. M. Daguerre in Paris, he published an article on daguerreotypy that revolutionized portraiture in Antebellum, Alabama. As she notes, the first photographs made in Alabama are portraits, and they were made within months after instruction in making daguerreotypes reached America. Both George Cook and Nicola Marshall, not quite so curiously, enjoyed much of their early careers in the Black Belt, a region later to give us the achievements of Ann Norton, Rose Weaver, Clara Weaver Parrish, John Lapsley, Crawford Gillis, all from Selma. And yes, from Montgomery, the neo-activist and feminist, at least in furthering the medium of printmaking, Anne Goldthwaite, and the artist and social activist Charles Shannon. Selma, billing itself as the Athens and Rome of North America, also thought of itself as a cradle, or crucible even, for artists, long before it became infamous for opposition to civil rights. Its symbol, a bridge, in this case, one to be crossed, rather than one that joined peoples, times, and places together. The name of this region of Alabama, where the planter reigned over his kingdom of cotton, and which cuts through the very heart of the deep American South, derives from a description of what they thought of the land itself, rich, dark earth that defined the area. Impassioned folks have lived here since it was first settled. Planters and the enslaved, civil rights pioneers and the Ku Klux Klan, artists and educators, and always bureaucrats and politicians, as smarmy and unprincipled as in any other region of the nation. The appellation itself, in spite of its benign geological origins, is now associated with traditions of racism and paternalism that linger and abide on assumptions as much as on perceptions, sometimes erroneous, often mean-spirited. The nomenclature arising from the soil rather than from the majority population of African Americans presents a certain paradox in which perception has taken on an unhistorical truth, at least in the minds of those foreign to the region who know it only from the poet, the sociologist, the politico, from the do-gooder, as well as from the true believer. The Black Belt has its share of professional Southerners, each with a story to tell, an opinion to express, a truth to be decorated and disseminated. Perhaps a little more eccentric or far-fetched, the rural legend is often as bizarre and barely credible as the urban variety. As I began this talk, I remind you that I hail from this part of Alabama. I was born and reared in Sprott, made famous by the photographs of Walker Evans, but most forcefully and poetically in the astringent but lovely prose of James Agee, who found that the lights all over Alabama were out. Our state, as entrenched as it was in poverty, despair, and disillusionment. The Black Belt is a place where, in the film of The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, Carson McCullers' mute singer played air music with his fingers, where ignorance is born from prejudice and vice versa, where illiteracy, unemployment, and race baiting are endemic, enough to remain commonplace, albeit becoming less unfathomable every day for the rest of the nation with its share of the same problems. It is a place where boredom has been proposed as the true impetus for the high rates of suicide, and if not death for the despondent, then exile to somewhere not there, to the place Thomas Wolfe sought, a land more kind and forgiving than our own. The Black Belt bleeds population, with the young abandoning the rural area as soon as opportunity and their money allows their departure for greener grass and a rosier future. Those who love this place, as I do, remain in spite of the environmental racism that has torn apart such communities as Uniontown and Emell, two towns whose very names evoke a troublesome past and an uncertain future. For those increasingly few who remain in central and south central Alabama, many of them aged and dying, the lamps of the Black Belt at least glimmer, if not glow, not entirely extinguished by destitution, racism, and illiteracy. It is said that usually, that lonely, hot winds from Scuba, Mississippi, blow through towns like Gee's Bend, Kalaja, Thomaston. Towns so scorching in summer that one sees the very air one breathes. Heat and humidity join the soil in defining this place, this land. This is what I mean in this talk, this legacy of the planters whose portraits I have shown you tonight. I have tried to talk to you about those who founded this state, its first citizens, and now in 2019, those who live outside the more affluent towns of North and East and extreme South Alabama. Those folks who have returned or who have stayed or who have not yet left. They stay perhaps because of our state's off-panoramic beauty in its landscape of pine and pecan, of wiregrass and black dirt, of blue blood and redneck. We are all peoples of color. Just as we cannot recapture the untroubled days of our youth the state cannot return to the conflicts and glories of its founding. What we try to read in the faces of those Alabamians of early statehood as we celebrate this bicentennial, we have to remember that historicism is not history, and we are still in search of the true story of our past, one no longer mythological, exaggerated, or even fabricated, yet truly our own, our personal relation to who we are, to what we hold dear, to the quaint, lovely question the good people of South Alabama used to ask when inquiring of your origins. Not, where are you from, but more directly, more sincerely, more precisely, where do your people bury? No truer statement can be made of this anniversary we commemorate tonight than the statement made on the walls of the Archives Museum. The state of Alabama was born out of the struggle for this land. Our forebears, for better or worse, recognized that truth as a social, political, and economic dynamic. Our artists, especially the portraitists of this early statehood, understood their role in affirming the social construct as well as reinforcing that relationship to the earth from which the state was carved. Annie Dillard described this bond so well. Quote, when everything else has gone from my brain, the president's name, the state capitals, the neighborhoods where I lived, and then, at length, the faces of my friends, and finally, the faces of my family. When all this is dissolved, what will be left, I believe, is topology, the dreaming memory of land as it lay this way and that, close quote. I thank you for listening to me this evening, to this admittedly personal description of early portraiture in Alabama, a talk that for me, for myself, has become a self-directed plea to return, to come home, to find again that part of me that will always be Alabama. Thank you.